Hey everyone, Elizabeth here. The Last Laugh delivers stories that leave you speechless. If you're here for it, hit subscribe and let's go.
The text came the Tuesday before Thanksgiving and it was from my brother Gary. Mom wants everyone at the house Sunday. No excuses this time. I read it twice. Then I put my phone face down on the kitchen counter next to the white porcelain mug with the chipped handle, the one I'd had since my second apartment in 1987. And I stood there for a moment listening to the radiator tick. I am 63 years old. I have been a landscape architect for 31 of those years. I have 2 adult children who call me on their own initiative and a dog named Porter who prefers my company to anyone else's. I own my house. I have by most measures built a life. None of that has ever mattered at Sunday dinner. Some families argue about money. Mine argues about who gets to be remembered. I went to Sunday dinner. Here's what you need to understand about my family, and I'll tell you the way I told my therapist. Not in a straight line, but in the pieces that surface when someone finally asks. My father's name is Raymond. He is 81 years old and has been the center of every room he's ever walked into, not through charm but through sheer insistence. Raymond was the youngest of 5 brothers, all of them raised by a father who believed in a strict accounting of who mattered and who didn't, and Raymond had spent his whole life clawing himself up that particular ledger. He became a civil engineer. He built a decent life in a mid-sized city in western Pennsylvania, raised 3 kids, and somewhere in all of that decided that his greatest contribution to the world was managing other people's potential. My mother, Lorraine, is 79. She has always been easier to love than Raymond, and I think that's the thing that cost me the most, because her softness made it harder to name what was happening. She wasn't cruel the way Raymond was cruel. He was just selective. Lorraine loved us all. But she organized that love in a hierarchy that Raymond had drawn up, and she honored it the way she honored everything, quietly without ever acknowledging that the ledger existed. Gary is 61. He is 2 years older than me and has spent our entire lives being Raymond's proxy. When Raymond couldn't be somewhere, Gary went in his place. When Raymond had an opinion about a decision I was making, Gary delivered it. Gary runs a mid-size contracting firm, drives a very clean pickup truck, and has a wife named Denise who sits next to him at every family function and nods at appropriate intervals. The cousin, his name is Floyd, and I want you to understand that Floyd is the child of Raymond's brother Ted, which means Floyd has grown up watching Raymond the way a satellite watches a planet, and he has absorbed every one of Raymond's opinions about me without ever having spent more than 14 hours in my presence across the span of an entire decade. The thing about being the one they called incapable was that it had started as protection. I know this now because I've done the work of knowing it. When I was young, 9, 10, 11, I was actually the most capable of Raymond's 3 children. I was the one who organized things, kept track of things, quietly solved the problems that Raymond didn't see. And Raymond, who had grown up being told he didn't matter, found that threatening in a way he couldn't articulate. So he started narrating me as less than I was. It was the only tool he had. She's always been helpless, he used to say, even when I wasn't. She needs someone to look after her. And children believe what their parents narrate about them, especially when the alternative is watching their father panic. So I made myself smaller. I learned to need a little more help than I actually did. I learned to ask Gary first, defer to Lorraine, and let Raymond feel like the ceiling I was pushing against rather than the floor I'd already left behind. I kept that up for 40 years. It is almost impressive in retrospect. The Sunday dinner in question happened on November the 18th at 7 in the evening in my parents' house on Greenvale Road, the house Raymond had designed himself in 1974 and about which he had strong opinions that I had been hearing since before I could read. Lorraine made pot roast. There was a Dansk casserole dish of roasted potatoes that had been in rotation since 1991. Gary brought a bottle of wine that Denise chose. And Floyd came because Thanksgiving at Ted's was apparently complicated this year and Raymond had told him Sunday dinner was fine. I brought the marigold pots from my back porch, 2 of them because Lorraine had admired the ones I grew last year and I'd overwintered some cuttings. Nobody mentioned them when I set them on the porch railing. That was fine. The conversation was what conversations in that house had always been. Raymond held court on the subject of local development projects and why every contractor working in the county except Gary was doing it wrong. Denise asked about my children, which was kind of her, and I told her about my daughter Nell's new apartment in Cleveland and my son Patrick's work with a trail restoration project in the Alleghenies. That's when it happened. Trail restoration, Raymond said. Not a question. A notation. Patrick's always been good with his hands, I said. He got that from my side. Raymond looked at Gary. Gary looked at his wine. Your side, Raymond said. You mean the side that can't manage a checkbook? I set down my fork. That's not accurate, Dad. We paid your car insurance until you were 28, he said. Don't tell me what's accurate. Raymond. Lorraine's voice was gentle. It was always gentle. That was the problem. I'm just saying, Raymond said. We kept that girl afloat for years. She'd have been nothing without us carrying her. You know that. He looked at Floyd. You know that. Floyd, who didn't know anything, said, we all know it. And Gary didn't say a word. I picked my fork back up. I cut a piece of pot roast. I chewed and swallowed. Does anyone want more coffee? I said. I drove home in the dark with the radio off. The maple in my front yard had lost most of its leaves by then, and the remaining ones were caught in the porch light when I pulled into the driveway, orange and rust, moving slightly in the wind off the ridge. Porter met me at the door with the enthusiasm that only dogs can sustain past the age of 9, and I sat down on the floor of the entryway with my coat still on and let him climb into my lap. He is 47 pounds. He has never understood that he is not a lapdog. I have never corrected him. I sat there for a while. The thing about what Raymond said was that it wasn't new. He had been saying variations of it my whole life. She's always needed propping up. We're the only reason she got where she is. Without us, she'd be nothing. He said it to Gary, to Floyd, to Lorraine, to anyone who'd absorb it. He said it as a fact, the way you'd say the sky is blue or water runs downhill, a thing that required no defense because it was simply a feature of reality. What was new was that I'd finally gotten tired of carrying it. That had happened 8 months earlier in March when my colleague Phoebe, who had worked across the hall from me at the landscape architecture firm for 11 years and had known my family situation in the abstract way that colleagues know things, told me about a lawyer named Delphine Carr. She handled my aunt's property situation, Phoebe said. We were eating lunch at our desks, which is what we always did on Wednesdays. Phoebe had a bowl of something with a lot of ginger in it and I had leftover soup. It was very specific and she was methodical. She didn't waste a word. What kind of situation? I asked. Family held a piece of property she'd been maintaining for 30 years, Phoebe said. My aunt had put in the money, put in the work, been there every summer. But it was still in my grandmother's name. When my grandmother passed, the family just redistributed. Didn't consult my aunt at all. I put down my spoon. What did the lawyer do? I said. Phoebe gave me a look that meant she understood the real question. She helped my aunt identify what she could actually claim, she said. What was documentable? What had been paid for by whom and when? And she helped her file for it on her own terms before anyone else could move. I want to tell you about the property before I tell you what I did with it. My grandmother on my mother's side, Lorraine's mother Vera, had owned a piece of land outside a small town called Harwick. 11.4 acres, mostly woodlot, with a stone cottage that had been built in the 1930s and updated precisely twice since. Vera had bought it in 1961 with money she'd saved from 30 years of working as a bookkeeper, and she'd left it to Lorraine when she died in 2003. Lorraine had meant to do something with it. Raymond had opinions about what she should do. For 20 years they'd argued about it in the slow, inconclusive way of people who fundamentally disagree but won't say so, and in the meantime the cottage had sat. Except I'd been going there. I'd started driving out on weekends in 2009 when my marriage ended and I needed somewhere to be that wasn't my house or my parents' house or Gary's house. I'd paid to have the roof patched in 2011, $4,200, written check, carbon copy in a folder in my filing cabinet. I'd hired a stonemason to repair the retaining wall in 2014. I'd put in a new water heater in 2017. I'd replaced the porch boards in 2019 and the kitchen floor in 2021. I kept every receipt. I kept every receipt because I'm a landscape architect. Keeping records is what I do. It wasn't strategy at the time. It was just who I am. In total, over 14 years, I had put $38,470 into that property. Not including labor. Not including the weekends I spent there pulling invasives out of the woodlot, or the summers the first regrade the drainage channel myself, or the mornings I sat on the back porch with the Earl Grey from the green tin and watched the light come through the birches and felt something loosen in my chest that I couldn't feel loosen anywhere else. Lorraine had never formally transferred it. It was still in her name. And Raymond in 2022 had mentioned at Thanksgiving, casually the way Raymond mentioned things he'd already decided, that he thought they should sell it. There was a developer interested in the Harwick corridor, he said. Maybe it was time. He did not ask me. I called Phoebe on a Monday morning in March and asked for Delphine's number. Delphine Carr's office was on the third floor of a building that smelled like old carpet and good coffee, and her desk had 4 tidy stacks of files and a philodendron that she'd clearly had for many years. She wore reading glasses on a chain and had a habit of writing things down longhand while you talked, as though the pen was how she thought. Her emails were 1 line long. She signed them with her initial. You've been contributing to this property financially and materially for 14 years, she said at our second meeting when I brought the folder. She flipped through the receipts without expression. You have documentation for all of this? I have documentation for all of it, I said. And the owner, your mother, has she been aware of your contributions? Yes, I said. She never objected. Has she ever indicated a wish to transfer the property to you? I thought about the conversations we'd had at the cottage over the years. Lorraine standing on the porch in her good slippers, looking at the repointed stone wall. You've done so much with this place, she'd said once. I always thought it should have been yours. She's indicated it several times, I said. Informally, Delphine wrote something down. This is what I want you to do, she said. I want you to call your mother alone. No Raymond. Tell her what you're proposing. Give her a week. I drove home after that meeting in the November rain, took Harwick Road instead of the highway, and sat in my car in the gravel pull-off by the cottage for 17 minutes. The lights were off. The birch trees were bare and yellow-white against the gray sky. The porch boards I'd replaced were still holding. I'm going to tell you about that drive. Not the one in November with Delphine, but the one 8 months later, the morning I came home from the signing. But not yet. Hold that. There was a period in the weeks between calling Lorraine and getting the papers ready when I almost stopped. I need to tell you about that honestly. It was a Thursday night in late September. Patrick had called earlier in the evening about the trail project and I'd been glad, and then he'd hung up and the house got quiet and I found myself sitting at the kitchen table with the leather journal that has the broken spine. I've had it for 12 years and I keep meaning to get it rebound and I never do. And I was looking at the list I'd made of the receipts, the amounts, the dates. $4,200 in 2011. $6,870 in 2014. $3,150 in 2017. $8,940 in 2019 and 2021. And the rest, the smaller amounts, the bags of concrete and the cans of wood sealer and the rolls of copper flashing, totaling $15,310 over the years between. I looked at those numbers for a long time. What if I'm wrong? That was the thought I kept circling. Not about the facts. The facts were in the folder. But about the interpretation. What if this is just what families do? What if the price of belonging somewhere is that nobody keeps score even when the score is real? What if doing this makes me the person Raymond always said I was? The one who couldn't be grateful, couldn't be gracious, had to turn every act of family into a transaction. My hands were cold. The kitchen was quiet except for Porter, who had found his way under the table and was pressing his warm flank against my ankles. I sat there for 22 minutes. I know because I looked at the clock when I finally got up. I got up because I thought about the developer. I thought about Raymond mentioning it the way he mentioned things he'd already decided. I thought about the porch I'd repaired and the stone wall and the birch trees in the gray light. And I thought, the person who can't be grateful is the one who took 14 years of my weekends and never once thought to ask. I closed the journal. I texted Delphine, still on. Let's schedule the signing. She wrote back in 11 minutes. Tuesday 7:30 a.m. Bring the folder. Forgetting is accidental. What Raymond did was not forgetting. It was a decision made so early and so consistently that it had hardened into something he'd stopped noticing. But I had noticed. And now I had done something about it. On Tuesday, November 19th, I left my house at 6:58 a.m. The first frost was on my windshield. A thin skim of white that I scraped with the card I kept in the door pocket. An old library card that had expired in 2019 but was the right shape for scraping. I drove to Delphine's building. I parked in the same spot I always parked. I went up to the third floor, which smelled the same as it always had. Old carpet, good coffee, and Delphine was already at her desk. She had the quitclaim deed printed and organized, clipped to a manila folder with her initial in the corner. Your mother signed her portion last Wednesday, Delphine said. She set a second mug of coffee in front of me without asking. The notary witnessed. Everything is in order. I sat down. When your father finds out, I said, it's going to be bad. It may be, Delphine said. That's not a legal matter. No, I said. It's not. She turned the document to face me and placed a pen at the top. I signed my name at 7:42 a.m. The notary, a young woman named Gail who had a small potted cactus on her windowsill and wore her hair in a braid over one shoulder, witnessed and stamped. By 8:14 a.m., the deed was filed at the county recorder's office. I drove back to my house the long way through Harwick. The birch trees were bare and perfect. The cottage porch was gray in the early light. There was a thin line of smoke from the chimney of the property next door, and the frost was still white on the grass in the shadows. I pulled into the gravel pull-off and sat there for a while with the engine running. I did not cry. I'm not sure what I felt was something that had a simple name. It was closer to the feeling of setting down something heavy that you've been holding for so long you forgot you were holding it, and feeling in your arms for the first time in years what their actual weight is. I went home and fed Porter and went to work. I told no one except Phoebe, and I told her only that it was done. Good, she said. We were eating lunch at our desks, a Wednesday same as the one where she told me about Delphine. How do you feel? Strange, I said. That's normal, she said and went back to her ginger bowl. What I had not anticipated was the shape of the silence. I had expected when Raymond found out an eruption. Raymond had eruptions. I had been preparing for one my entire life. I knew the signs and the sequence, and I had developed, over 6 decades, a reasonable capacity to absorb the blast. What happened instead was that Lorraine told him. She told him the following Thursday, 2 days after Thanksgiving, when everyone had gone home and it was just the two of them in the house on Greenvale Road. I know this because Lorraine called me that Saturday morning. He's not speaking to me, she said. I'm sorry, Mom. Don't be. She was quiet for a moment. I could hear the radiator in her kitchen, the same one that had been ticking since before I was born. It was the right thing. I should have done it 10 years ago. You did it now, I said. Your father will come around, she said, but she said it the way people say things they're not sure are true. He doesn't entirely understand how it happened. What did you tell him? I told him I signed it over. He asked if the lawyer forced me. I told him I called the lawyer. She paused. He didn't like that. No, I said. I imagine he didn't. What Lorraine didn't say and didn't need to say was that Raymond had always assumed, that when it came time to deal with the Harwick property, he would be the one doing it. He would negotiate with the developer, manage the paperwork, make the decision. That was the natural order as Raymond had always understood it. His name wasn't on the deed, but in his accounting of family that had never mattered. Some doors you close. Others close themselves and you're just there to notice. This one had closed. I was there. Gary called 3 weeks later. I don't want to get in the middle of this, he said, which is what Gary always said when he was already in the middle of something. You're not in the middle of anything, I said. It's a real property transaction. It's done. Dad thinks you manipulated Mom. Dad can think that. She's 81 years old. She's 81 years old and she called Delphine on her own and signed the papers on her own and then told Dad on her own, I said. Give her some credit. There was a long pause. How much did you put into that place? Gary said. It was not the question I expected. $38,470 over 14 years, I said. Not counting labor. Another pause. I didn't know that, Gary said. Nobody asked, I said. Floyd did not call. Floyd's opinion remains, as far as I know, what it has always been. The developer Raymond had been thinking about called his office in January, having heard through someone in the county recorder's network that the Harwick property had changed hands. Raymond, who did not know the developer, had already inquired about the property to Delphine's office and received a firm answer. Referred them to Gary. Gary, to his credit, called me before doing anything else. There's a developer, he said. I know, I said. Are you going to sell? No, I said. He was quiet for a moment. What are you going to do with it? He asked. I thought about the birch trees, the frost on the grass, the morning light through the cottage windows. I'm going to go there on weekends, I said. Like I've been doing for 14 years. Raymond and I had our first real conversation about it in February, 4 months after the signing. He called on a Sunday morning, not the evening when he usually called but the morning, which told me he'd been awake thinking about it. "I don't understand why you didn't talk to me," he said. "Because it wasn't your decision," I said. "I'm your father." "You are," I said. "That's not the same thing." He was quiet for a long time. "Your mother wanted it done that way," he finally said. It was the closest Raymond had ever come to acknowledging that Lorraine had a will of her own. "She did," I said. "The developer was offering well." "I'm not interested in the offer." "You put in money," he said slowly, as if he was discovering this in real time. "I didn't know about the money." "I know you didn't," I said. "That's part of what I'm telling you." He didn't answer that. I didn't expect him to. We stayed on the phone for another 4 minutes talking about Patrick's Trail project, and then he said he had to go and I said all right and we hung up. It was not reconciliation. It was not an apology. But it was the first conversation I'd had with my father in 63 years in which I had not performed smallness. I thought that was worth something. It is late April now. The birch trees at the Harwick property have their early leaves, that thin, bright, almost translucent green that only lasts about 2 weeks before it deepens and becomes ordinary. I drove out last Saturday with Porter and a bag of groceries, and I lit a fire in the cottage fireplace because the evenings are still cold, and I sat on the back porch with the Earl Grey from the green tin while Porter patrolled the woodlot with the particular diligence of a dog who has been doing the same job for years and has not yet satisfied himself that the perimeter is secure. Lorraine came for a weekend in March. It was her first time back since 2018. She stood on the repaired porch and looked at the stone wall and the grated drainage channel and the marigold pots I'd brought from home and placed along the south-facing railing. "You've done so much," she said. "I wanted to," I said. "That's the difference." She understood what I meant. I know she did because she put her hand on my arm for a moment before she went inside. "Raymond has not come. I have not invited him. That door is unlocked. The terms are not complicated. Come here and see what I made and see me for what I've actually been and we can have something real. Don't come and what we have is Sunday dinners where I cut pot roast and ask who wants more coffee, and eventually one of us will stop having those too." He is 81 years old. I am not carrying his choice for him. Gary came in April with his own initiative and no announcement. He stood on the porch looking out at the woodlot, and I made him coffee in the kitchen where the floor I'd replaced was still clean and even, and we didn't talk about Raymond and we didn't talk about Floyd and we didn't talk about what he'd said at Sunday dinner. We talked about Porter. We talked about Patrick's Trail project and whether Gary could get his crew to do some of the stone work. We talked about Nell's apartment in Cleveland and whether the building had good bones. Before he left he stood by his truck, a clean one, same model as always, and he said, "I didn't know about the money." "I know," I said. "But I did." He nodded once and got in the truck and drove back down the gravel road. Family is the first place you learn what kind of silence you'll tolerate. I had tolerated mine for 60 years. The silence after the quitclaim deed was different. It was the kind I'd chosen, which meant it fit differently. It had room in it. I went back inside. Porter was asleep in front of the fireplace with his nose on his paws, entirely at peace, which is something I am learning in the mornings in the places I built with my own hands to approximate.